There are people waiting on the other side of your obedience. They need somebody to help them figure out how to save their impossible situation. And they're waiting on the other side, but they don't know that they're waiting right now. But as you trust the Lord and you go forward, God's going to use you in that way because they're waiting. So we're going to make some observations as we see Jesus developing his disciples. The first thing we're going to notice is that disciples will be called to step out in faith. You want to write that down. They're called to step out in faith. So when Jesus calls them to step out into faith, they're literally going to be going out into the unknown. There's going to be a sense of uncertainty. Now, another way of saying this would be as they step out in faith, this means, and write this down, this means out of their comfort zone, out of their comfort zone. No one grows as a disciple, no one grows in any area of their life without going outside of their comfort zone. It's the same thing with being a disciple. So if we're going to grow as a disciple, there's going to come a point where in our following him, he's going to call us to step out of our comfort zone. Now, how many of you here and you're following the Lord have had to at a certain place step out of your comfort zone? Good. If you follow the Lord, he's going to call you to step out of your comfort zone. Now, when God calls you to step out into the unknown, of course, there's going to be some uncertainty. It's going to be outside of your comfort zone. But when God calls you to take that step of faith, as you take that step of faith and God shows up in your circumstance in a way that you say that could only be God, God uses that to grow you in your faith and bolster your faith as you go forward. So we'll see that more as we go. So we also have to understand that these are disciples. So I want you to write this down. They've been following Jesus, so this is just their next step. It's just their next step. They knew Jesus, they trusted Jesus, they followed Jesus, and now he calls them to take a next step, and now they're going to step out. The walk of faith will involve a continuous, throughout your whole life, taking next steps of faith. The step of faith that you take today, when you take that step, there's going to be another step in the future. This step that you take today prepares you for the next step, which he will call you to in the future. So again, as God calls you to step out in faith, he shows up. He uses that to grow your faith, to trust in his faithfulness as you go. These disciples are like us. They have to step out into faith, and we'll unpack that as we go. And here's why, and I want you to write this down and we'll unpack it. They have to step out in faith because someone is waiting on the other side of my obedience. You want to write that down. Now, I put it there very personally, and we'll talk about that. So if they don't step out in faith, in obedience, then there's going to be whole villages that will not hear the gospel. They won't be prepared for when Jesus comes to those villages. Lives won't be changed. So they have to step out because there are people who are waiting on the other side of their obedience. And the truth is, those people, they don't even know that they're waiting at this point, but they're waiting on the other side of the disciples' obedience. It was years ago where we as a congregation, we sensed the Lord telling us that we needed to build another facility. So we took steps of faith, we sacrificed, we prayed, and we built this facility because we believed that there were people who were waiting on the other side of our obedience. What we didn't know is that when this building was built, more than an extra 1,000 people showed up the first year. They had been waiting on the other side of our obedience, but they didn't even know they were waiting on the other side of our obedience. We've been talking about starting a school. We're praying about that. We're taking steps of faith because we believe that there are thousands of children right now who don't know that they're waiting, but they're waiting on the other side of our obedience. Does that make sense to you? So maybe it's not the corporate waiting on the other side for our obedience. Maybe it's something very personal. Maybe right now you are in what seems to be an impossible marriage. You just don't know how it's going to work out, but you're sensing that the Lord has not released you from this. Well, here's what I can tell you. There are people who are waiting as you work on this marriage, you let the Lord bring healing into your marriage. There are people waiting on the other side of your obedience. They need somebody to help them figure out how to save their impossible situation. And they're waiting on the other side, but they don't know that they're waiting right now. But as you trust the Lord and you go forward, God's going to use you in that way because they're waiting. Maybe right now it's an addiction. You've tried and tried and tried, but still you're still facing the same thing. I want to encourage you one more time, if for no other reason, just because there are people who are waiting on the other side of your obedience, and they don't even know that they're waiting. But when you overcome that and you begin to walk in freedom, there's going to be so many people who are waiting for you to help them walk through that situation. So here's what I want to say for all of us, and we could go through many scenarios, but here's the question we're going to ask today, and this week as you go home, consider this and ask the question, who is waiting on the other side of my obedience? They don't even know they're waiting, but they're waiting. Well, on this journey as we go on, the good news is the disciples don't have to go alone. So as these are new disciples, he's not going to remove fellowship from them. They're going to go out and do what God's called them to do, and God realizes that they need accountability, they need fellowship, they need friendship, so he's having them go out 2 by 2. We also notice, because they are disciples, and we also notice that in this step, write this down, all they have to go on is his word. They're just going on the fact that he said, go. Now, as a disciple, there will come a time in your life, if you choose to be a disciple, when God will call you to step out, follow what he said, and all you have to go on is his word, a promise. You know it's from him, and he's called you. But here's what you need to know. Even though that's all you have to go on, just understand that not everybody in your world is going to understand that you are following him because of his word. Because in this story, Jesus doesn't explain it to all the crowds. He doesn't explain it to everybody. He just tells the disciples, this is what I'm calling you to do. And so they're going to step out based upon what he says, and that's all they have to go on. And we'll see that even more. But disciples, they go forward based upon God said, what his word says. Now, on this journey, write this down, they're going to have to trust God for provision. So verse 4, it says, carry no money belt and no bag, no shoes. Now, when it says no bag, you go, what does that mean? Well, it's a word that has a lot of uses. You could call it a knapsack. But if you have a study Bible, one of the things that you might find in your margin is it will call it a beggar's bag. So here's what this means, and commentaries also affirm this in the word itself. If you've ever been a beggar's bag, so you ever been somewhere and somebody comes, they have their guitar and they open their guitar case, they pull out their guitar, they throw a few bucks in the guitar place and they begin to play, and those bucks are there so that you know when you go by, that's where you put the money. Am I the only person who's ever seen this before? So you see that. So that's the idea of a beggar's bag. So the idea that we're going to preach and we have this little bag here, and that's where you throw the money. Jesus is not on this trip. We're not going to do this. This is a short-term missions trip, and you're going to have to trust me for provision. Now, one of the first lessons somebody will learn when they decide to become a disciple, to step beyond, to begin to grow, is God's going to place them into a situation where they're going to have to trust God for provision. The way that you learn to trust God for provision is allowing God to put you into a situation where you can't provide for yourself. And so here, he removes all of their ability to provide for themselves. And he says, don't worry about it. I'm going to show up. Now, when he does that, he shows up, that's going to increase their faith for the next time that God calls them to step out. Also, we find, next thing, you want to write this down, they have to trust God for protection. Now, I find verse 3 very interesting. He says, verse 3, go, behold, I send you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Did you notice that he doesn't send them out as sheep, which would be mature lambs? He sends them out as lambs, baby sheep, in the midst of wolves. That's the idea there. So at last service, I said, they don't even get to be Lambo, and nobody laughed. So it's just, So I'm not even going to mention it this service. I'm just going to move on. So disciples learn to trust God's protection when God places them in a situation that will be hostile to them, and he is their protection. Psalm 23 says, thou prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You know, until you're in that situation, it's just a nice poem. You don't really learn that until you're in that situation and you're surrounded by hostile people, and then you see he is your protection. So the way that you learn that is he places you in those situations. Now, you don't put yourself in that situation, but if he allows you in that situation, then he's going to teach you that.